I welcome you, my dear friends, to the official channel Story for Deep Sleep, a place where dreams become knowledge and the very voice guides you through the silence of the night. We have a very special story by our fireplace tonight. A story about a woman who became a legend while she was still alive. A woman whose name was spoken in whispers, with lust, fear and delight. A woman who held in her hand the threads of great empires, and at the same moment, drops of poison intended for herself. This is the story of the last queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. In this lecture you will hear how Cleopatra found herself at the center of a great political game between Caesar, Antony, and Octavian, what Alexandria looked like during her reign, and why the city was a wonder of the ancient world, why Cleopatra conquered not only with her beauty but also with her intelligence, how love and intrigue caused the fall of Rome's greatest general, what is true and what is fiction in the legend of her death by snakebite, and how Cleopatra was transformed from a real woman into an eternal myth, archetype and symbol. If you like our story, support it with warmth. Subscribe, click on the bell and leave a few words. Your support helps new stories to sound in this silence. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the sound of the surf of the Mediterranean Sea, a gentle breeze ruffling the sails. We are standing on the pier of ancient Alexandria, a city where the line between luxury and myth disappeared in the sunset gold. I invite you on this journey. Today we will travel to the place where legends live. Chapter 1. Alexandria is the heart of ancient Egypt. Close your eyes and imagine. The scorching midday sun scorches the white walls of the houses, and a salty breeze blows in from the sea, smelling of distant lands. The streets are buzzing with a multi-voiced crowd, merchants shouting prices, philosophers arguing in shady arcades, children chasing pigeons at the columns. This is Alexandria, a city where desert and sea meet, where the past breathes in the ear of the future, and life itself seems like a dream poem in the language of the gods. In the middle of the 1st century BC, Alexandria was not just the capital of Egypt. It was the showcase of the Hellenistic world, the pride of the Ptolemies, the embodiment of the Greek dream on African soil. The city stretched between the Mediterranean Sea, the waters of the Nile and the sands of the Sahara. 500,000 inhabitants, an incredible number for those times. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Romans. Each with his own faith, his own god, his own shadow. The city hummed, pulsed, shimmered like a gem caught in a sunbeam. The Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, stood on the coast. It served as a guiding star for all who sailed to the riches of Egypt. According to legend, the light of its fire was visible for 50 kilometers. The lighthouse stood as a god guardian, silent, indestructible. It was the first to welcome travelers and the last to see off the waning. But if the lighthouse was the body of the city, its soul was the library. The Library of Alexandria, the temple of knowledge, where all that mankind knew was collected. Ships arriving in the harbor were required to hand over copies of all the books they carried on board. The original stayed here, among the papyrus halls, where it smelled of dust, wood and mystery. In its silence one could hear the breath of Pythagoras, the footsteps of Herodotus, the smile of Homer. There, in this abode of the mind, an invisible alchemy of meanings was at work. Alexandria was like a fabric woven from many threads. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religious rigor, Roman business and Oriental sensuality. Here one could see the temple of Isis, next to which stood the pharmacy of the philosopher cynic. Here festivals lasted for weeks, and while at one end of the city there were debates on the immortality of the soul, at the other there were flutes and the crunch of wine in blue glass goblets. It was an arena city, a city of mystery, and it was here that fate was preparing the stage for young Cleopatra. She was born not into poverty, not into obscurity, but neither was she born in peace. Within the walls of the royal palace, among silks, gold and marble, among Persian carpets, Greek tutors and Egyptian rituals, she grew up, the future queen. And everything around her whispered of greatness and doom. Alexandria wasn't just the capital. It was the beginning, and just as the sea holds the reflection of the stars, so this city held the reflection of her destiny. Chapter 2. The birth of Cleopatra. The name Cleopatra sounds like a myth. But in its time it was commonplace, so called almost all the queens in the Ptolemaic family. Our heroine is the seventh Cleopatra, but only she went down in history as the last queen of Egypt and one of the most influential women of the ancient world. Why her? Why not her sisters, not her mother, not another ruler? To understand this, you have to go back to the very beginning. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC in Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, one of the largest and most enlightened cities of the ancient world. Her father was Ptolemy XII Avlet, a man controversial and, by the standards of history, weak. His nickname, Avletus, means flute player. It was a nickname that carried derision. It didn't speak of musicality, it spoke of frivolity. The flute in ancient culture was considered an instrument for pleasure, entertainment. A king who plays the flute is not a king, but a jester, not a statesman, but a figure of ridicule. The people of Egypt did not respect him, the treasury was empty, taxes were high, the country's influence was minimal. Most importantly, he was dependent on Rome. The Ptolemies in general were a dynasty of outsiders. The Ptolemies came from Macedonia, from the north of Greece. Their ancestor, Ptolemy I Soter, was a close associate of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, he received Egypt as a satrapy and then founded his own dynasty. During their 3 centuries of rule, the Ptolemies never once mixed with the Egyptian population. They ruled as Greeks, spoke Greek, preserved Hellenistic culture, and intermarried between relatives so as not to dissolve among the local elites. Egyptian traditions were respected but remained a showcase. The kings remained outsiders. Who was Cleopatra's mother is not known. Most likely, it was Cleopatra V Tryphena, perhaps one of the king's concubines. The woman is mysterious, she disappears from the sources soon after the birth of her daughter. Perhaps she died, perhaps she was eliminated. This adds to the fog in the early biography of the queen. But one thing is clear, Cleopatra grew up in an atmosphere of intrigue, in a house where there were no strong marriages and clear unions. The Alexandrian palace in which she was brought up was luxurious but dangerous. It had everything, gold, marble, colonnades, libraries and halls for scholars, but also envy, fighting, denunciations. There were many heirs, brothers, sisters, uncles, counselors, all weaving intrigue. In this environment, a child either breaks or learns. Cleopatra learned. From an early age she showed a lively mind, observation and extraordinary self-control. She did not shout, she did not demand, but listened and memorized. That was her first weapon. The education she received was considered the best in the Hellenistic world. The Library of Alexandria and the Museion, the academies where the best minds gathered, were very close by. She was taught rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the art of diplomacy. But most importantly, she learned to speak. Plutarch wrote that Cleopatra spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian, which was incredible for the Ptolemies. Before her, no ruler of her dynasty had even attempted to speak to the people in their language. She spoke Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Syriac, and Hebrew. Language became for her the key to power. She could do more than just negotiate, she could charm. When she was about 14 years old, her father was expelled from Egypt, the people revolted, the treasury was empty, the government collapsed. Cleopatra went into exile with him. They spent several years outside the country, trying to gain the support of Rome. It was then that Cleopatra first encountered real international politics, with Roman senators, bankers, lawyers, generals. It didn't take her long to realize, Egypt could no longer exist independently of Rome. If you want to rule, you must speak Rome's language, and not just literally. When Ptolemy XII returned to the throne with the support of Roman legions, Cleopatra was no longer a girl. She knew what the game looked like. He died 2 years later, bequeathing the throne to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was 10 years old. According to tradition, they began to rule together, as brother and sister, formerly spouses. But in fact the struggle began. Cleopatra showed at once that she was not going to be her brother's pawn. She received ambassadors alone, issued coins with her own name on them, signed decrees without her brother. Soon his regents began to act. In 49 BC she was banished from the capital, formerly her brother won and began to rule alone. Cleopatra traveled to Syria, gathered a small force, enlisted mercenaries, and began to prepare for her return. She negotiated, wrote letters, looked for allies. And most importantly, she waited for the moment. She had no army, but she had the intelligence, the will, and the realization that if she wanted to return, she needed to do more than just enter Alexandria. She needed to do it from a position of strength. This begs the question, why did Cleopatra need Caesar? She understood perfectly well that without external support, without an ally who was more authoritative and powerful, she could neither regain the throne nor hold it. Egypt was a source of grain for Rome, and any instability in the country worried the Senate. If you get the support of one of the most powerful men of the time, you can not only regain power, but also secure your future. Cleopatra wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for an ally. But to get Caesar, she had to make the first move. Such a moment came in 48 BC when the Roman general Gaius Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. He was pursuing his enemy, Pompey, and found himself in Alexandria at a time when the country was split between brother and sister. And it was then that Cleopatra decided to take a desperate step. But more about that in the next chapter. By the time she was 21, Cleopatra had already lost everything, her power, her hometown, her allies. But she hadn't lost the most important thing, her ability to think. She believed not in gods, but in calculation. Not in predictions, but in action. And that's what made her not just Cleopatra 7, but the Cleopatra the world will remember. Chapter 3, Cleopatra and Gaius Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Egypt finds itself embroiled in the affairs of the Roman Republic, but not as a player, but as a board on which two fates converge. One was Cleopatra, an exiled queen stripped of her throne but not her ambition. The other is Gaius Julius Caesar, one of the most powerful and controversial men of his time, the victor of Gaul, the hero of the Civil War, the dictator who was expected in Rome, but he arrived in Alexandria. Caesar arrived in Egypt in the midst of internal strife. After Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus, he fled south in the hope of finding support from the young Ptolemy XIII. The Egyptian court, hoping to please Caesar, decided to be proactive. Pompey was killed immediately after landing, his head and seal presented to Caesar as a sign of loyalty. But they miscalculated. Caesar, though a politician, was also a Roman, brought up in the tradition of mos maiorum, ancient common law. Pompey was his son-in-law, a former ally, a citizen of Rome. He was not to be killed without trial. Caesar's anger was quiet but dangerous. He gave Pompey a lavish funeral and stayed in Egypt. Caesar found himself in Alexandria with a small garrison of about 7,000 soldiers. He realized that the city was troubled, the country was divided, the people were angry, and there was tension in the capital. He was in a foreign city, among people he didn't trust. And that's when Cleopatra makes her move. The story of the carpet is legendary. It has been described in different ways. Some talk about a carpet, others about a sack of cloth. Either way, it was a brave act. Cleopatra was in exile, access to Caesar was closed, but she knew, if he sees her, she will win. On her orders, one of her loyal servants wrapped her in a luxurious carpet, which then under the pretext of a gift delivered to Caesar's chambers. When the cloth was unwrapped, before him appeared not a dusty puppet, not a frightened woman, but a young, graceful, smiling Cleopatra. Caesar was 52. He had just won one of the bloodiest civil wars ever fought. He still had a legitimate wife, Calpurnia, in Rome. But he was known for his many affairs, including with the wives of senators. His reputation as a man who loved women had long gone beyond Rome, but in politics he remained a cold strategist. But cold in politics. Meeting Cleopatra, however, changed things. She was 30 years younger. She was 21, but there was no naivety in her. She came not to ask, but to offer alliance, loyalty, influence, charm, Egypt. Antique sources give different descriptions of Cleopatra. According to Plutarch, her appearance was not classically flawless, but there was something much stronger in her voice, manners, ability to speak, charisma. Her speeches were musical, her intonations precise, her logic ironclad. She didn't just speak, she mesmerized. In addition, she created an atmosphere around her. Caesar was surrounded by luxury, glitter, smells of incense, fabrics, gold, light, but everything was not shouting, but masterfully built. Like a setting for a myth he was supposed to believe in. Caesar remained in Alexandria. The so-called Alexandrian War began, his army was besieged, and the supporters of Ptolemy XIII rebelled. Cleopatra stayed with Caesar. He called for reinforcements, and in the Battle of the Nile defeated Ptolemy's forces. The boy king drowned, and Cleopatra again became the ruling queen of Egypt. Formally, she shared the throne with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who was only 11 years old. In fact, she ruled alone. After the victory, Caesar stayed with her in Alexandria for a few months. It wasn't just an infatuation. It was a symphony of interests. Cleopatra gave him a son, Caesarion. Caesar recognized him as his own, though not officially. And when he returned to Rome, he didn't forget her. In fact, he summoned her to the capital. In Rome, Cleopatra's arrival caused a sensation. She took up residence in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, accompanied by an entourage, jewelry, exotica. People came to see her as a miracle. The common Roman public was shocked. She spoke Greek, wore strange clothes, lived with the dictator but was not his wife. Rome was traditional, strict, and the treatment of women in public, especially Oriental women, was prejudiced. Cleopatra's appearance broke all conventions. Caesar initiated a reform of the law that allowed a Roman citizen to have more than one wife. He was suspected of wanting to create a monarchy, to transfer power to his son from an Egyptian woman, to restore the royal tradition. The very idea that the son of a queen from Alexandria could claim the throne frightened the elite. The aristocrats whispered, Caesar had gone mad. It was not just a union of two people. It was a conflict of cultures, civilizations, worldviews. Rome, with its strictness, tradition, military discipline, and Cleopatra, with her soft power, aesthetics, education, refined cruelty and ancient right to divinity. And so the myth was born. Cleopatra was no longer just the queen of Egypt. She became a symbol of Oriental magic, a femme fatale who could woo the most powerful man in the world and make him change the course of history. She became an archetype, a shadow, a whisper, a temptation. And at that moment, history began to turn into legend. But fairy tales don't like undertones. Cleopatra wasn't a witch, and she wasn't just a lover. She was a strategist. She needed an alliance with Caesar because without Rome, she couldn't hold power. He was her chance, as he would later become Antony's chance. But back then, in 48 BC, it was only the first act. The first myth. The beginning of something much bigger than just a love story. Chapter 4. Caesar's death and Cleopatra's flight on March 15, 44 BC, on a day that would later be called the Ides of March. An event occurred in Rome that changed the course of all ancient history. Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator, reformer, military genius and a man who once let a woman from the banks of the Nile into his heart, was assassinated in the Senate chamber. The assassination was meticulously planned. More than 20 senators, among them his former associates, stabbed him 23 times with a dagger. His last words, according to legend, were when he saw Brutus, "And you, Brutus?" The reasons for the assassination were political and deeply personal. Caesar had concentrated too much power in his hands. He was made dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. He broke laws, rewrote them to suit himself, redistributed land, appointed officials without consulting the Senate. He disregarded the formal republican system, destroying what the Romans considered the basis of their freedom, collegiality and the power of the Senate. His ambitions became more and more apparent. He publicly wore purple, a symbol of royal power, accepted honors as a monarch, allowed statues to be erected to himself, and an image on coins during his lifetime. His authority was absolute, but to the senators he became a threat, not so much as a man, but as a precedent. If they let him, the republic was over. In addition, his personal decisions, including his ties to Cleopatra, seemed defiant. There were rumors that he intended to move the capital to Alexandria, marry Cleopatra, and make Caesarion his heir. All this frightened and embittered the Roman elite. He was already ruling as a dictator for life. For many, it was too much. By then Cleopatra had been living in Rome for almost 2 years. After the end of the Alexandrian War and Caesar's return to the capital, she arrived in Rome not as a prisoner, but as an ally and mother of his son. She was lodged in a luxurious villa across the Tiber, outside the city limits, so as not to formally violate the public rules prohibiting the stay of foreign rulers within the city. In Rome, she was met with suspicion and fear. The people did not know how to treat her. For some, she was the embodiment of the ancient East, luxurious, mysterious, strong. For others, she was a threat, a stranger, a seductress who distracted Caesar from Roman affairs. Cleopatra did not lead a secluded life. She was seen accompanied by a retinue with exotic animals, jewelry, and Caesarion in her arms. She attended feasts, followed politics, and perhaps hoped Caesar would recognize the child officially. He was indeed attached to her. He ordered a statue of her to be erected in the Temple of Venus, which was unthinkable to the Roman public, a foreign woman in the pantheon of gods. He spoke of new laws, reforms, the right to dual citizenship. All this frightened the senators. To them, she was a symbol of the monarchy they were trying to destroy. After Caesar's death, the city went into shock. The streets were deserted, the Senate locked its doors. The conspirators first hoped that the people would accept the decision, but that was not the case. Caesar was popular with the people, especially the veterans. The people mourned. Clashes broke out. The streets were dangerous. Cleopatra realized she was now a symbol of the power that had just been killed. She could not stay in Rome. At night, guarded by loyal men, she secretly left the villa. With little Caesarion and her closest servants, she made her way to the Tiber, where ships were waiting for her. The journey back to Egypt was hurried, secretive, and full of anxiety. On the way, she probably burned documents, got rid of possible evidence, and prepared for her return, not as the dictator's mistress, but as the mother of the heir, who was now to be erased from memory. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra again found herself in the role of an independent ruler. Officially, she became co-ruler with her son, Ptolemy XV Caesarion. But he was still an infant, and everything depended on her. She engaged in what she knew best: consolidation of power, negotiations, surveillance. She knew that sooner or later Rome would reach out to Egypt again. The question was not if, but who. Caesar remained in her memory as more than an ally and lover. He was a lesson to her. She could no longer rely on one man. She realized that to survive in the world of Roman intrigue, you had to think like them. And now, at the center of her world was not only the throne, but a child, a boy she believed to be the legitimate son of Julius Caesar himself. In him she saw an extension of power. Soon Cleopatra was destined to enter a new game. A game where the stakes would be even higher, and where a new ally would take the stage. Mark Antony. Chapter 5. Mark Antony. The meeting and the golden years. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt after Caesar's death, she realized that her position was once again precarious. She was the ruling queen, but with no outside support. Rome, a former ally, had splintered into pieces. Caesar was dead, and in the void left, new figures were rising rapidly, ready to re-divide the world. One of them was Mark Antony. Antony was a veteran campaigner, a loyal associate of Caesar, a man with a rare combination of charisma, brute strength, and political flexibility. He was not a refined intellectual, but he was a born military leader, an excellent orator, and knew how to act when others only conferred. The people loved him for his generosity, the soldiers for his brotherly attitude. He was feared, but recognized. However, after Caesar's death in Rome there was a competitor, a young, almost inexperienced, but very calculating Octavian, adopted heir to the dictator. Between them began a new struggle. In 43 BC, the Second Triumvirate was formed to stop another round of civil war. Antony, Octavian and Lepidus shared power, formally to restore order. Antony got the east, and with it, Egypt again. Antony knew Cleopatra well. He had met her before, in 55 BC, when he was a young military tribune. Then she was still an unknown princess. Now she was a queen, a woman patronized by Caesar himself. She had become part of the myth, and now Antony wanted to see her again. Perhaps he had already envisioned something more than an alliance. In 41 BC, he summons her to a meeting in the city of Tarsus. Formally, to get help, fleet, gold, resources. But informally, to test her, perhaps to conquer her. He was sure she would come as a petitioner. He was wrong. Cleopatra arrived in Tarsus as a goddess. Her ship was a floating temple, gilded decorations, purple sails, ritual fragrances. She staged her entrance as a theatrical production, herself as Aphrodite, surrounded by dancers, musicians, servants in Greek and Egyptian garb. Antony, accustomed to Oriental luxury, was nevertheless stunned. But not only outwardly, she immediately began the game. She joked, argued, charmed, easily, without crossing boundaries. She didn't ask, she insinuated. He was older, more experienced. She was younger, but wiser. Together they formed a duo in which each enhanced the other. She gave him what Rome did not: enthusiasm, respect, myth. He gave her what Egypt demanded: protection, an army, a big name. They became lovers, but it wasn't just passion. It was a formula. She inspired, he acted. They arrived together in Alexandria. There the golden years began. It was a time that would later be written about with admiration and condemnation. Their court became a symbol of Oriental luxury, wealth and sophistication. Every evening was a spectacle. Feasts were organized on palace terraces covered with vines, under the stars reflected in mosaic fountains. The halls were decorated with flowers, the scents of incense wafted through the air, and dishes were served on silver, obsidian, and gold utensils. The menu was composed like a poem: ducks in rose petals, quails in grape sauce, fish stuffed with nuts and figs. Each feast was an exquisite work of art, where food, presentation, smells and music were combined into a whole. The society of the inimitable was not just a select circle. It was a carefully constructed system of court culture where play, art, and eccentricity became a way of demonstrating power. Members vowed to throw only original parties, competed in ingenuity, served dishes decorated with pearls, ate lotus and rose flatbread, and drank wine infused with saffron, cinnamon, and violet petals. There was a certain ritual at feasts. The guests came dressed according to the theme of the evening, sometimes in antique togas, sometimes in oriental clothes with long sleeves and belts embroidered with gold. Women decorated their hair with peacock feathers, men wore earrings and aromatic amulets. Servants trained by the best tutors served food in choreographed order. Music sounded not in the background but in response to the scene: harpists, flutists, dancers, poets recounting the exploits of the gods and love. Once, the story goes, Cleopatra dissolved one of her earrings of large pearls in vinegar and drank its contents to prove that no feast in the world could be more expensive. Antony ionized, she parried. Their conversations were an art, their jokes a challenge. At feasts there was live music, there were actors, acrobats, reciters. There were jesters, philosophers, even scientists, and everyone who entered this circle knew that he was part of a legend. Cleopatra used the holiday as a form of power, Antony as a way to relax from Roman austerity. Together they created a world in which every evening was unforgettable, every day filled with pleasure. But there was already an unsettling note in the fun: it was all too bright. Too provocative to last forever. But while it lasted, it was splendor. Every meal was a political statement. Every joke was a test of loyalty. Every gesture was part of a strategy. Their feasts were not just a display of opulence, but a means of cementing alliances, a demonstration of generosity, strength and power. In this splendor, Cleopatra felt more powerful on the throne than in the council chamber. But there was work behind the scenes. Cleopatra financed Antony, his campaigns, his policies, his projects. In 40 BC, she gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Antony, meanwhile, had gone to Rome, where, in order to preserve the political alliance, he married Octavia, Octavian's sister. It was a cold calculation, and Cleopatra understood it, but she didn't forgive it. For 3 years she waited. When Antony returned to the east again, he was different. More cautious, more mature. He was no longer just dreaming, he was building an empire. And in that building, she was not an ornament, but a partner. He gave her land, Cilicia, part of Syria, Phoenicia, Cyprus. In 36 BC, he began a new eastern campaign. Cleopatra accompanied him, as an equal, as an ally, as a queen. In 34 BC, the apotheosis, the so-called gifts of Alexandria. In the square, to the sound of hymns, in gold and purple, he announced that from now on Cleopatra is Queen of Kings, that their children receive the titles of rulers of the eastern provinces. Most importantly, he recognized Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Caesar, as the rightful heir. It was an open political statement. It was a challenge to Rome. And it was the first step towards war. But for now, they were golden years. In their world of glitter, music, triumph and whispers, Cleopatra lived as she wished. She ruled as she knew how. And loved, someone who became not just a weapon for her, but a man she felt stronger beside than alone. Until history reminded her that Rome does not forgive weakness. Chapter 6. The Last War, Cleopatra and Antony versus Rome. After the gifts of Alexandria, when Antony publicly granted Cleopatra and her children titles and lands in the eastern provinces, the peace between him and Octavian finally collapsed. These actions were seen in Rome not as an eccentric gesture, but as treachery. Octavian launched a full-scale campaign to discredit Antony. He had the most powerful tool at his disposal, the word. And he used it with ruthless precision. He read in the Senate falsified letters allegedly written by Antony, in which the latter expressed contempt for Rome, called himself an Egyptian, and planned to move the capital to Alexandria. He claimed that Antony was ready to hand over the Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children. Public opinion, shocked and humiliated, did not demand proof. The anger was directed at both, the Roman triumvir who had dishonored his honor and the foreign queen who had subjugated his will. In 32 BC, the Senate officially declared war on Cleopatra. Formally, not to Antony, to keep the legal appearance, but in fact, against both. The last war of the Republic had begun. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a fleet of about 230 warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, catapults, Egyptian gold, and Eastern allies. They were opposed by Octavian's fleet under the command of his admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, smaller in number, but more maneuverable, disciplined and better equipped. The decisive battle took place on September 2, 31 BC, at Cape Actium, in the Ionian Sea, off the west coast of Greece. Antony positioned himself on the shore, protecting a narrow strait. He expected Octavian to attack from land. However, Agrippa conducted a brilliant naval operation, cutting him off from supplies, seizing coastal bases and intercepting naval maneuvers. Antony and Cleopatra were trapped. Their troops were suffering from disease and starvation. Their eastern allies were beginning to desert them. The situation was becoming desperate. A final attempt was made to break through to the open sea. At dawn, in the thick smoke of fires and the shrill of horns, Antony's fleet went into battle. The battle lasted all day. Egyptian and Roman ships engaged in close combat, ships collided, rammed each other. Catapults threw flaming shells, burned masts collapsed into the water, decks flooded with blood. Antony commanded from the flagship. Cleopatra was behind, with her squadron in reserve. Suddenly, to the amazement of all, Cleopatra ordered her ships to retreat. She turned around and went towards the open sea. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. Perhaps she realized that the battle was lost. Perhaps it was a pre-planned maneuver. Antony, seeing her ships moving away, interrupted the battle and rushed after her. His men were left without command. They were demoralized. The fleet had fallen. Antony and Cleopatra set sail for Egypt. They knew it was the end now. But they didn't give up right away. In Alexandria they began a last desperate attempt to gather troops, to organize a defense. They fortified the harbor, rebuilt the walls, tried to negotiate with the Eastern powers. But the allies did not come. Egypt was left alone. In 30 BC, Octavian's troops approached Alexandria. The final battle took place near the walls of the city. Antony led the last of his troops into battle. He was exhausted, devoid of faith. His army didn't fight back. The soldiers surrendered. In the midst of the chaos, false news reached Antony. Cleopatra was dead. Broken, he fell on his sword. Dying, he learned that she was alive. He was taken to her tomb. Blood, tears, crushed words, and the end. He died in her arms. Cleopatra tried to negotiate with Octavian. She hoped that he would leave her power, spare Caesarion, let her keep at least part of Egypt. But Octavian was cold. He wanted to bring her to Rome as a trophy. A queen in chains, the crown of his victory. Cleopatra gave him no such triumph. To the last she remained in her palace, keeping outwardly calm. She understood, there is nowhere to retreat. In the last days of her life, she spent in the tomb, where she ordered to bring the most expensive jewelry, symbols of her royalty and ritual objects necessary for farewell to life. There are two main versions of her death. According to the first, the most romanticized, Cleopatra ordered to bring a basket of figs, under which was hidden Egyptian cobra, Widget, a symbol of royal power. She allegedly allowed the snake to sting herself in the chest or arm. This version was accepted by Roman historians because it combined drama, symbolism, and a sense of grandeur even in death. Another version, more prosaic but no less likely, speaks of a poison hidden in the hairpin, ring or cream with which she rubbed the wound. It could have been a fast-acting poison, known at court to guarantee a quiet and quick death. Some historians believe the snake was too unreliable a method and the queen, with access to healers and poison experts, opted for a more precise remedy. When Octavian's soldiers opened the tomb, they found Cleopatra in royal attire, with a tiara on her head. Her face was calm, her posture solemn. On either side of her lay the maids, Ira and Harmina, who had voluntarily followed her into death. Harmina, barely alive, tried to adjust the crown on her mistress's head. This gesture went down in legend as the final symbol of loyalty and dignity. She walked away with dignity. Caesarion was killed on Octavian's orders. Egypt became a Roman province. The age of the Ptolemies was over. But Cleopatra's death is not the end, but the birth of a new legend. Of a woman who toyed with the most powerful men of her time. Who was ruler, diplomat, mother, lover and symbol. Her death was the culmination not only of a personal tragedy, but the end of an entire world, a world of Hellenism, of independence, of Oriental splendor. She lost, but she lost in such a way that her name is still remembered today. Chapter 7. Cleopatra, Myth, Beauty, and Power. Speaking of Cleopatra, it is impossible not to recall the image that has become immortal, a woman shrouded in mystery, a symbol of seduction, exquisite beauty and incredible strength. But who was she really? What was behind the thick arrows, aromas of incense and soft voice that captivated the most powerful men of her time? Her story is not only a drama of love and political alliances, but also the art of being yourself in an era when women were relegated to the role of silent shadows. The woman who became a myth, almost all ancient sources emphasized, Cleopatra's appearance was not outstanding. And yet, centuries later, she is perceived as a standard of beauty. Why? Because Cleopatra created herself. She realized that beauty is not just facial features. It's a voice, a scent, a look, a gesture, a fabric, a light, a pause in speech. It's scenography. She masterfully managed the impression. Her outward appearance was part of the strategy. Her famous makeup with black arrows, green malachite and antimony shadows was more than just decoration. It protected her eyes from sun, dust and insects, and gave her eyes depth at the same time. She arranged her hair in intricate coiffures, weaving threads of gold, flowers and feathers into it. Fragrances were an important part of the look. The queen knew how perfume could affect perception. Her body was fragrant with incense, from musk to cinnamon. Cleopatra's cosmetic secrets. Her chambers contained bronze mirrors, alabaster and glass vessels filled with creams and oils. She used honey, milk, almond oil, aloe, and cedar resin. Recipes for masks and scrubs attributed to her have been preserved. A mixture of ground rose petals, donkey's milk and salt was used to soften her skin. Her baths became legendary, a bath in donkey's milk to which honey, incense and herbs were added. It was a ritual where body care became an act of self-deification. Cleopatra didn't just adorn herself, she created the atmosphere. Every appearance was a spectacle. Her servants scattered flower petals, her clothes rustled like rustling wings, her voice sounded soft and commanding. She appeared in white or navy blue cloths embroidered with embroidery in the form of sacred symbols. Her crowns and necklaces carried meanings. The cobra on her forehead was a symbol of protection. The necklace with the image of Isis was a sign of her divine mission. Why did she need that image? In a world of men, where decisions were made by sword and edict, Cleopatra used other tools: atmosphere, a sense of wonder, mystery. She could not be forgotten. She could not be described in a single phrase. She worked through enchantment, through the feeling that you were in another world. It wasn't caprice, it was survival. Egypt at that moment was not an empire, but a fragile, rich pearl surrounded by wolves. And the queen had to be more than just powerful. She had to be magic. So that people would be drawn to her. So that she would be seen not as a woman, but as the embodiment of a goddess. Facts behind the image. Firstly, Cleopatra was the first Ptolemy to learn the Egyptian language. This allowed her to speak to priests and common people without interpreters. She knew how to inspire confidence. Secondly, she participated in religious rituals, not only as a ruler but also as a priestess, linking her power to the ancient gods. Thirdly, her court was not just a residence, it was a cultural and philosophical center. She read poetry, discussed medicine and politics, and made astronomical observations. Lastly, Cleopatra personally received ambassadors, controlled revenues, and revised the tax system. Cleopatra's image is not about the shape of her nose or the length of her neck. It's about power embodied in symbols. She knew that women don't forgive a mistake in dress and men don't forgive a mistake in voice. And she wasn't wrong about either. She was an actress, a philosopher, a strategist and a ruler. But most of all, she was herself. She showed that beauty could be a tool, language a weapon, and softness a form of power. Her image, carefully constructed, thought out to the smallest detail, became her political shield. In a world of brute force, she created an alternative, power based on culture, admiration and meaning. That's why Cleopatra didn't fade away. That's why she's not just a story. She's energy, feminine, independent, unyielding. And that's her true, eternal beauty. When we think of Cleopatra, we see more than just a queen. We see a woman who managed to turn her life into a legend. She wasn't flawless, but she was alive, strong, flexible, human. Her path was full of defeats, but she wrapped each one in a symbol. Her image lived in her gestures, in her voice, in her silence. Today, more than 2,000 years later, her name sounds like a symbol, not a person. A symbol of a woman's timeless power. When we remember her, we remember that there are different kinds of power. And that history remembers not those who shouted the loudest, but those who knew when to speak, and how to speak. Close your eyes. Imagine the light fragrance of incense, the warm light of torches, the rustling of fabrics. And in this flickering gloom, the figure of a woman standing alone with her head up. Not surrendered, not forgotten, Cleopatra, thank you for being with us on this journey through the pages of history. May the images of the ancient world, like the calm surf, continue to resound in your thoughts. May Cleopatra's voice, not powerful, but deep and human, remain with you as a reminder that strength can be found in beauty, in knowledge, in silence. Good night, my dear friends. See you again under the stars of history.
Mm-hmm.